Welcome to the Metta Hour Podcast with Sharon Salzberg, where Buddhist wisdom meets everyday life. This podcast is brought to you by the Be Here Now Network. If you're interested in supporting this podcast, visit www.BeHereNowNetwork.com/Sharon. Enjoy listening.
Hi, I'm Sharon Salzberg, and I'm so happy today to be speaking with my longtime friend and colleague, Roshi Joan Halifax. Roshi Joan is a Buddhist teacher, a Zen priest, an anthropologist, and pioneer in the field of end-of-life care. She is founder, abbot, and head teacher of Upaya Institute and Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, where we teach together every year. Roshi Joan received her PhD in medical anthropology in 1973 and has lectured on the subject of death and dying at many academic institutions and medical centers around the world. She is the author of many books, including her latest, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet, which was released on May 1st, 2018. Welcome, Roshi Joan.
Thank you. I'm very happy that we're talking now, and also I'm happy I get to see you soon.
I know, that's so fantastic.
It is really great. Yeah.
And, massive congratulations.
We should make a habit of this.
What's that?
We
should make a habit of it?
this.
We definitely should. I'm glad you're coming east in August.
Thanks to you.
No, that's great. And really massive congratulations on your book. It's so beautiful looking. And the content is so powerful. This is great.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. We're really lucky. We ended up with a wonderful publishing house, Flatiron, Mexico, and wonderful people. And, I haven't gone back and read the book in its current form. I have this physical object. I saw it only a week ago when I was in Seattle. So I saw it for the first time, and it was so physically beautiful. But I haven't had the nerve to actually open it up and read it.
Did you do an audio version of it?
I did an audio version, 26 and a half hours in the studio.
That tiny little studio in the Flatiron building, or a different one?
No. I did it in a wonderful studio here in New Mexico, Cabby Kapikoff. Fabulous, totally set up for, reading books, and wonderful young man who was the engineer. But, it's one of those things where I hadn't read my other books. Somebody else read them, I'm sure, wonderful people, but they were so speedy in the reading. And I was kind of glad they asked me to read the book, that, Flatiron asked me to read the book. But I was also like, I know this is going to be onerous. And it was, fortunately, the young man who was the engineer was really kind and patient, and also the place was very pleasant to be in. But, it was no windows, of course, and you're in this small, nice little room. But it's kind of strange to be reading aloud your own work. And trying to imagine, while in this kind of gray room with a boom mic hanging over you. And, you're at the same time kind of writing it and recalling the experiences you're writing about. And it's a fascinating experience. I'm not one to produce a book a year, so I don't think I'll be doing this again for quite a while.
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Unlike you, my dear.
Well, yeah. I don't know how that happened. Somehow it's happening. And speaking of my most recent book, I want to tell a story which is really about you. You've heard me tell it. Before we go on to your book. So my most recent book was called Real Love, the same publisher as Roshi Joan's, Flatiron. And I was incredibly late turning it in. I finally turned it in. I think it was 2 years late and 1 day early. I was very proud of the 1 day early. And when I turned it in, I got an away message from my publisher. And I thought, hey, could he give me another 3 weeks or something? And finally, he came back from vacation and he read the book, and he wrote me and he said, I really love the book. And the part of the book I loved the most was when you quote Roshi Joan saying something like, don't force yourself to think of the traumas of your life as gifts. Think of them as givens. And first I thought, wow, that's a fantastic quote. And then I thought, that's odd. His favorite part of my book, I didn't even write. Roshi wrote it. There you go. But actually, I wanted to say that as a context for, because sometimes when you talk about these qualities, it's very hard not to over-idealize or seek perfection in them, and think I have to feel a certain way. And really, it's a journey.
No kidding. I'm in the middle of this training of clinicians on care of the dying that we offer here at Upaya every year. And, the room is filled with these bodhisattvas who have dedicated their lives to compassionate care, but are super stretched and stressed. Mm-hmm. I have learned so much from people in the healthcare profession, but also people who are working with refugees and in the prison system and, humanitarians of every stripe. It's been quite a journey learning, about the power of these qualities that are essential for us as human beings to maintain our humanity. At the same time, there's a shadow part to certain of these qualities that I write about that cause a lot of suffering for those who want to serve.
So maybe I'm going to quote from your book, and we can go through these qualities perhaps one by one and talk about the almost like the purified form, maybe you'd say, or the kind of boundless form, and then talk about the shadow side as well, which would be great. So here's your quotation, which says I guess you're talking about 5 internal and interpersonal qualities that are keys to a compassionate and courageous life, and without which we cannot serve, nor can we survive. And the first of these qualities is altruism. So I don't know if you'd like to start there.
Well, yeah, this is that capacity that we mobilize very naturally when we're in the presence of someone or some being who's suffering, or we're aware of a whole world that's suffering or a country that's suffering, and we respond in a seamless way to benefit the other, and it's at some cost to ourselves, and it's fundamentally selfless. It's like, Sharon, you and I and anybody listening to this podcast, we wouldn't be here save for the altruism of our parents. No matter how complicated our parents were, still, they didn't let us die on the spot. Nice of them. Yep. But, when altruism causes mental and physical harm to the altruist, then it's tending into what's called pathological altruism. And, pathological altruism can also harm the person you're trying to serve. It can also harm the institution that you're trying to serve or that you're serving in. So it's a very rich area, and I know you know what it's like because you work, in people who serve those who are subjected to domestic violence, and you work with all kinds of people in the service professions. And, with the cost of burnout, the cost of so much empathy that you're in a certain way contracting the illness of the very people you're serving. And so pathological altruism is something, I've encountered it myself. How about you?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And one of the quotes I have from you is, altruism at its best is a radical expression of connection, concern, inclusivity, and a sense of responsibility regarding the well-being of others. It is about consciously not robbing others of their autonomy by helping or fixing them.
Wow, did I write that?
You did write that. It's fantastic, and it's very subtle.
Yeah, it is.
Because you're not urging apathy, I'm sure. No,
I think one of the ways that we, altruists get off the track is by robbing others of their autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
And that's this process, of perceiving the other as not having the resources to actually bloom themselves.
Mm-hmm. I remember Zainab Salbi and I were once speaking at the same conference, and she was the founder of Women for Women International, which is one of those organizations where you sign up and you get a person to write to, a woman in some war-torn country. And she was talking about meeting somebody in Afghanistan and coming back and telling the woman's story and telling her story and telling her story. And she said at one point she realized that she was only talking about her suffering. She never mentioned her resources. Like the woman was an attorney, or the woman had some education, or she had this ability to care for others, or whatever it was. And, so we can also kind of go down the rabbit hole that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that often we underestimate others. And somehow, seeing the truth of a person's challenges, difficulty, trauma, is really important. By the same token, it's important to also look into their gold, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
to see, wow, this person somehow made it through a war. What were the qualities that made it possible for her to survive?
Mm-hmm. You also write, another part of altruism is to explore how our culture, race, gender, sexual orientation, education, class, and personal history create biases and values that shape our behaviors, and how our privilege and power relative to others influence the expectations we have about serving others.
Wow.
What did you mean by that?
That's really true. Well, part of it, I think later in the section that you just read, I go into a piece around gender and how, in a certain way, there is a gender bias toward altruism in women. And Tanya Singer indicates that gender bias shows up in terms of neural architecture.
Mm-hmm.
And I've met many men who are great altruists. But that women as, if you will, as mothers, even though you and I don't have kids, but we live in a culture where the kind of motherly heart or grandmotherly heart is something that's very associated with women. And although I've met many men who have motherly hearts and grandmotherly hearts, but that it's a cultural expectation for women to actually manifest more selflessness, more altruism than often it is for men. And this is not necessarily the best thing in the world. I think we should expect all beings, all people, to be altruists, men and women. And I think that also women, my mother was a really good example of this. She just dedicated her life to being a volunteer. She was, in the Second World War, a gray lady, so she worked in Biltmore Hospital, taking care of the wounded who came home from the war. And then the day she died, she was a pink lady at Banner Oaks Hospital, delivering books and magazines to dying people. And then she died that night. But her whole life was, she was a volunteer. She always gravitated toward those who were less fortunate, who were less resourced. And part of her gravitation, which I think influenced me unconsciously, was that she had some kind of social identity as a good person. And that was as distinct from my father, who had a social identity and probably personal as well, as a man of accomplishment. And
successful.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so her sense of agency, of identity, of power, of meaningfulness, all came out of this need to be appreciated for being such a good person, a caring person. And I think, it was funny, Sharon, when I was, I practiced with a Korean Zen teacher named Dae Sansanim.
Mm-hmm.
And in a Dharma combat once, he asked me, what had I been doing, something like that. And I started to make this long list of all the good things I've been doing to help others. And then he kind of hit me with his Zen stick, and he said, "Oh, bad bodhisattva," which I thought, "Oh, thanks a lot." But I had it was a sort of a wake-up call.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of got what he was saying, that somehow I had my identity in helping others had a quality of ego in it that was not great.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't recognized it. And I was also, which evolved later in the conversation with him, I was kind of hogging the stage with my goodness and not making it possible for others.
Let me tell you one more story about how good I am.
Get in the act.
Yeah.
So I was like, funny. I felt quite chastened. I was like, oh, wow, thank you.
Yes, he was very good at doing, actually. So let's move on to the next quality, which is empathy, which you mentioned a bit before, and its relationship to altruism. Empathy is, how are you defining it? I sometimes define it as resonating with the experience of others.
Yeah, this is a interesting thing. It's often empathy is often conflated or confused with compassion, but this really is a kind of resonance at the physical level, at the emotional level, and cognitively with another. And it's as though we expand our subjectivity to include the identity of another in a kind of intimate way, or we're vibing together. And empathy is important. I write in the book something like a world without empathy is a world where we're dead to each other. But also, if our empathy isn't regulated, if we over-identify too much, we can be overwhelmed. And one of the examples I cite, we know this from, emotional empathy, which is pretty familiar to most of us. But I cite the example of cognitive empathy. At least I think I do. I use it in my talks quite often, where all these good people in Germany, who I'm sure were principled, one day began to look out of Hitler's eyes and think like him, and almost as though they were being brainwashed, and they took his perspective and then turned away. Jews and gypsies and homosexuals and, various populations that were being sent into the camps. And that's a kind of, that's where empathy can go wrong, cognitive empathy. Or emotional empathy, where, we're so identified with the suffering of our patient that we ourselves get overwhelmed. Or physical empathy, where we're feeling the pain of another, or like there's a very interesting type of individual. They're called mirror touch synesthetes. These are people who have deep somatic empathy with others. So they're getting all of this information at the physical level and usually experience overwhelm in relation to the suffering of others, or whatever the physical experience is of others. But it's really important but at the same time, it has to be regulated.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some people who just naturally regulate it. I'm probably not one of those.
Therefore, there are tools in order to learn how to do it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is where practice really is, I mean, it's one of the reasons I think that I do practice so in such a determined way and enthusiastic way, because I tend to be oversensitive and over responsive and reactive.
Mm-hmm.
This is, what practice does. It's allowed me to see things from another perspective, to reframe things, to have a metacognitive perspective, for example.
Mm-hmm.
It's allowed me to downregulate in a really gentle way when I'm getting ungrounded and about to lose it. And those are skills that have all come out of meditation.
That's great. Here's a paragraph from you. When we identify too strongly with someone who's suffering, our emotions can push us over the edge into distress that might mirror the anguish of those whom we are trying to serve. If our experience of his or her suffering overwhelms us, empathic distress can also cause us to go numb, to abandon others in an attempt to protect ourselves from suffering too heavy to bear, and to experience symptoms of stress and burnout. Here we have it. I've been, because I do so much work, as you know, as you do, with caregivers of different kinds, and I've seen kind of the push toward empathy training in the country, which I think is fabulous, because it certainly can be a cold, cruel country or situation for people, and yet the people I work with in those contexts have an enormous amount of empathy, but they're suffering in other ways.
Yeah. So Sharon, I'd love to ask you, what kind of approaches do you feel would, in your experience, help people get grounded and get regulated?
Well,
in the midst of someone else.
Some of it, quite a great deal of it, has to do with the concept of balance. So one aspect of balance is compassion for yourself as well as for someone else, and one aspect of it is, sometimes for very sensitive people, as you described yourself to be, there's a sneaky little thought that comes in that you are responsible for fixing it all. It's up to you. And so not only does the suffering kind of wash through you, but it lands. And, often there's some kind of thinking pattern. It doesn't have to be that, but it's often that. There's something going on so that suffering is being absorbed like you're a sponge. And so we learn certain tools to get some degree of balance. And what's very difficult for people often in those professions or in those, maybe personal caregiving role, may not be professional, in those roles, is to realize it's okay to have compassion for yourself, that this isn't like being weak or lazy. This is a very important balance.
I think that's, I think being able to respect your own limits. I know one of the phrases that you shared with me years ago, which I teach people all the time, may I see my own limits with compassion, just as I view the suffering of others.
Mm-hmm.
And just, being able to rest in a phrase like that, which has a reality to it that is healing for others and for ourselves. When you see someone who just ignores their health, ignores their own, the things that they care about in the world, in the course of taking care of others, that's not good. That's really not good. So I think, this brings us back not only to issues around empathic distress, but also, to pathological altruism. Because, one of the things about the edge states that I think is important is that they mirror each other, or not mirror, they're interconnected. So, this would be the other edge states are integrity, respect, and
engagement.
Engagement. And you know, integrity, respect, engagement are also embedded in altruism and empathy.
Mm-hmm. You have this kind of incredible quotation about integrity. You say, without integrity, our freedom is compromised. I've seen that integrity can have a fragile edge, perhaps more fragile than that of the other edge states. By this I mean that it often takes an experience of moral anguish, a push, a slip, or a tumble over the edge into the chasm of suffering to affirm or reveal integrity. I mean, that's amazing and very intense, too.
Yeah, most of the people whom I know who have what I consider to be high integrity have arrived at that integrity not because they've been intact the whole way,
Mm-hmm.
but that they've been exposed to suffering, maybe not of their own doing. Like Fannie Lou Hamer, I cite her life as an example, who was exposed deeply to moral suffering as she was the subject of egregious racism, and of course, everybody around her was. And that brought her integrity into high relief in, her work in the civil rights movement.
Mm-hmm.
But also sometimes our integrity is mobilized by experiencing various forms of moral suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, I define 4 areas of moral suffering, which are moral distress, which is, when we encounter a situation where harm is present, we see a pathway out of that harm, but we can't pursue that pathway.
Mm-hmm.
And so we suffer, and we suffer morally because we know that it could be different. And then there's moral injury, when we are witness to or engage in behaviors that cause suffering to others. And being witness to or engaging in those behaviors. Like, for example, moral injury is well documented in the military, causes one to feel deep shame.
Mm-hmm.
And I cite the story of my father, who I believe, unbeknownst to me and my sister, the sources of his depression.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't really till he was dying that we became aware of how deep his moral suffering was in relation to being a combatant in the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And on this big LST, and he was the commander, and he was part of the fleet, and they took down a bunch of planes and killed a bunch of their men by friendly fire. And just all came out as my dad was dying. So, wow, really stopped me. And then moral outrage. I do a big section in the book on moral outrage because I'm experiencing quite a bit of it right now, actually.
What a timely topic.
Oh, my gosh. I have to laugh, but it's not funny. It's, our political situation is so compromised, and players in our current political arena, models really the worst in the human psyche. And so, just like in the 60s, we were, people my age, a lot of us were involved in the civil rights and anti-war movement, and we experienced moral outrage. We wanted to change the system. We didn't agree with the politics of the time, and we realized we lived in a racist culture, and that we lived in a culture which valued violence. And so, it's like we're in the 60s revisited here. I mean, we're on the nuclear brink. You just can't believe Trump pulled out of this agreement today. And you experience moral outrage. And moral outrage that's episodic or reactive, I think, is not a bad thing, because it can push you to hold people accountable, or it can push you into action, which is transformative. But, some of my good friends suffer from chronic moral outrage.
Mm-hmm.
And they're kind of, that's the chord they are constantly playing in the world. And, one goes deaf after a while. And it's unpleasant to experience because it's filled with shame and blame.
Mm-hmm.
And, moral outrage is a combination of anger and disgust. It's not pleasant to experience, but it's, a little dose isn't bad.
Wakes us up.
It does wake
It does
us
wake
up,
us up.
but too much can be, addictive.
So did you cover all four of...
No, the last
okay.
one, Sharon, I actually, it wasn't anything I'd written about until just before I turned the book in. And I went to see the film about James Baldwin called I'm Not Your Negro. And I have to tell you, I was just like, wow, because he identified moral apathy. And I suddenly realized that I had been raised in a bubble of privilege to the extent that until I was, 16, 17, 18, I wasn't really aware of how deep the racism ran in our community.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there's moral apathy that is just ignorance. There's moral apathy where we consciously turn away from suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And there's moral apathy when we're just not in a bubble of privilege. We're not consciously turning away from situations of harm, but when we just go numb, we're just dead. And that latter kind of moral apathy often is the case for those people who experience too much empathic distress and go numb in relation to empathy.
So far we've talked about altruism, empathy, and integrity. Do you think it's all similar tools to bring us, I don't know if it's bring us back from the edge or bring us from the more toxic forms of these states to the more kind of free-flowing, generative forms of these states?
One of the things that I learned, which was for me staggering, Sharon, was that there is one means, one powerful way that the fraught side of these edge states can be transformed into the healthy expression. And that is compassion. And when I had this insight, in a, it's kind of like a sort of blinding flash. When I realized I was working on this map of compassion, realizing that it's not easy to train others in compassion, that many of the people that I encounter are literally suffering from a deficit of compassion. And, of course, if they're suffering from a deficit of compassion, those who are not receiving compassion also are suffering. And I began to map out compassion, and I realized that compassion is actually made of non-compassion elements. And those elements include our capacity literally to lend attention to another, our capacity to attend to another, to present another. And it also includes pro-social aspects, including loving kindness and equanimity. And it also includes insight, which, reflect, our intentions, which reflect our moral character. And compassion also includes insight. It includes the wisdom dimension, insight into, yes, we're all one, but there's also distinction between self and other. And all beings, no matter how deluded they are, they still want to be happy. and that, we in compassion we do the best that we can, but we can't be attached to outcome because that can produce more suffering. And insight also allows us to have a metacognitive perspective, to actually stand outside of our reactive response and to see things with, a greater depth of field.
Mm-hmm.
And then embodiment is part of the process of compassion.
Mm-hmm.
And, it involves action. So I as I did this big mapping and I realized, wow, compassion is a complex dynamical system.
Mm-hmm.
The emergent process of these suite of qualities when they interact with each other is compassion.
Mm.
And then I began to look at this in relation to altruism, empathy, integrity, respect, and engagement, and also the fraught sides of these five edge states. And I realized, these fraught aspects of the best in the human heart can be transformed into the direction of health through exactly the qualities that are composed in compassion.
That's fantastic. I remember seeing the Vietnamese Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh on a stage in New York once, and he pointed to like a sunflower, and he said, "Now see all the non-sunflower elements that make up the sunflower?" And you realize, in any instance we can go deeper into causes and conditions, and we can learn more about our lives, actually, that way.
Well, as you know, I was a student of Thai.
Yeah.
So needless to say, that perspective that Thai shared in so many wonderful ways influenced my thinking. And definitely, I learned so much from him in the years I practiced with him.
It's great. And we're lucky to have so many teachers that were...
Oh, it's so true, Sharon. Yeah. We have lived in a good time when, we've been able to experience Thai and, of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Tsoknyi Rinpoche and Mingyur Rinpoche, and there's so many beautiful, wise teachers. What a blessing. You are among that list.
Oh, you are so sweet. I want to finish our two other qualities, though, so before we just have a love fest with each other. So respect. Here's the quote. Respect and disrespect are closely linked with power dynamics. Power with and power over. Do you want to say something about that?
Well, this whole area got very open for me in the sharing that this nurse, who's a good friend of mine, a student of mine, Jan Janner, she did her chaplaincy thesis. She did her chaplaincy training at Upaya, and she did her thesis on what is called horizontal hostility. And, another way we call it is bullying. And what Jan learned is that some 15 to 20% of nurses actually leave nursing because they've been bullied by their peers. And, I also, because of my childhood experience, where I was quite ill as a child and then a little bit skinnier and littler than other people, was bullied quite a bit as a child. And then, of course, my experience as a woman has subjected me to a lot of bullying, particularly as I, found myself in worlds that were male-dominated, like academia, and then, of course, forgive me, all my Buddhist friends, but Buddhism. And, as a female practitioner in the Buddhist context. And so I began to look at horizontal hostility and vertical violence. And the horizontal hostility thing also, I was part of the feminist movement in the 70s, and it's incredible woman who was really the mother of the feminist movement, Flo Kennedy, who talked about this kind of harm that peers subject other peers, their peers to. And, I realized, wow, that is something that is really rampant in our society. And also vertical violence, where there's top-down violence, where, a teacher will abuse a kid, or where a parent will put down their child, or where, or bottom-up vertical violence, where a patient will be abusive to a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
So I unpacked that to, as deeply as I was able, because I feel we're right now in a kind of crisis of respect in our culture, and crisis of disrespect, and that it was helpful for me to actually thread through what respect is, and how it breaks down, and how it harms when it moves into disrespect.
Wow, thank you so much. And then just the last one, engagement. When our engagement gets off balance and our work seems driven by fear, escapism, or compulsion, we are vulnerable to burnout. We're back in burnout. That bleak experience of fatigue, pessimism, cynicism, and even physical illness, accompanied by the sense that our work is of little or no benefit to anyone, including ourselves.
Well, there you got it. I mean, I think engagement is really, your life and my life is, they're examples of wholehearted engagement. And, it's just totally loving what one does and finding meaning in the work that we do, and doing it enthusiastically. But I'll confess, and probably you might confess, but there's times I overdo it. And there's times when there's a kind of addictive quality to the work that I do, where I'm sort of obsessed and possessed. And so I don't think I've ever been burned out in the classical sense, but I've sure danced around the edge of it often enough. How about you?
Oh, I think I've probably been actually in it. I've certainly been on the edge, but yeah, I mean, I think there have been times when I just could not see that there was a whole other kind of balance needed. But I do find that things kind of tend to come back. There's some homeostasis or something that one's whole system seems to want, and over time there's just that clarity. But the real core of that is knowing that it's okay, to seek balance. And I've seen many times that can be very unpopular with somebody, like I just have to give and give and give and give and give. And it is too much. It's just way too much at some points.
Well, what I hope is that this book is not only of service to others, and, we all, or at least most of us, fall over the edge. And, one of the points I make in the book, Sharon, is that somehow, making our way back from the desolate landscapes that are the landscapes that these fraught side of the edge states represent, back to the high side of these edge states, actually builds strength of character and resilience. And I would say every time I've gone over the edge has been, in the long run, I've learned so much. And I feel a kind of appreciation for whatever it was that drew me out of the sense of futility and back into making my way out of the depths, the slough of despond, if you will, into a life of engagement.
That's fabulous. Roshi, thank you so much. I really look forward to seeing you and, going deeper and deeper always into this great book and all the work that you're doing. So thank you.
I'm just wonderful. Love you, and thank you for everything you do, Sharon.
Thank you.
See you soon.
Okay, dear. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much for speaking with me today. Your work continues to have such an incredible impact in the world, and I'm thrilled for your new book to reach people everywhere. You can learn more about Roshi Joan and her many offerings at www.upaya.org, and I encourage you to go out and get a copy of Standing at the Edge today.
Thank you for listening. For more information about Sharon's many offerings and her teaching schedule, please visit her website at SharonSalzberg.com.